Hi guys, we're back to talk about uneven aged silvicultural systems. So let me get us started here. Okay, so uneven aged silvicultural systems maintain later seral stage forest setup. So when we talked about succession, we talked about this change in the makeup of the plant community over time, because as different plants grow in, they change the microclimate around them and change which plants are more competitive. So in early seral stages, those plants that might do better in more exposed, sunnier, drier microclimates, like certain shrubs, like things like ponderosa pine, are going to be more competitive. And in these later seral stages, we may have more fir, more Doug fir, and then understories of more shade tolerant species like wood rose, etc. So these kinds of systems are going to mimic relatively smaller types of disturbances that might represent some of the smaller scale patch removal that might have taken place from smaller, more or lower intensity, lower severity fires. They might represent the removal of a certain tree or group of trees due to certain kinds of insect outbreaks or due to root disease, etc. And it's going to favor the regeneration of intolerant, it's going to generally favor the regeneration of more tolerant types of trees, although certain types of uneven age silvicultural systems like group selection are going to be a little bit more supportive of favoring intolerant trees, those trees that are intolerant of growing in the more shady conditions of the understory like pine. So in this case, we have group selection shown on top, where slightly larger patches are taken out, like 1 or 2 acre patches are taken out. Single tree selection, where we have only single trees or smaller groups of trees taken out, is gonna leave behind a more shady understory condition. And then down here, there's something that in this particular image is showed as green tree retention. Sometimes you see this as like variable density retention, and this is kind of an evolving field, but often you'll see even today that within even some more even age silvicultural systems like clear cuts, often forest operators, at least in California, are leaving behind a lot more patchiness of little groups of overstory trees for wildlife habitat, for a little kind of shadier microclimates, etc. So you might see something like this that might be called like a variable retention stand according to the California Forest Practice Rules. Okay, these uneven age silvicultural systems, like single tree selection that we'll start talking about, usually require the involvement of a little bit more kind of closer look at all the trees in the stand. And so particularly in the case of single tree selection, individual trees of all size classes might be moved throughout the stand. And so you might be removing some of the most dominant trees, some of co-dominant trees, some intermediate trees, as well as some suppressed trees. And then the idea is that you're promoting space for regeneration of the stand through just small gaps where a little bit more sunlight might get down to the forest floor and new seedlings might grow, or where what we call advanced regeneration can occur, where certain trees that might have been kind of stagnated in the understory can start to grow and compete more aggressively now that they have a little bit more access to resources and a little bit less competition. So this is typified by the selective cutting of merchantable trees, meaning trees that we can sell, usually to the mill to make lumber with, as well as cutting some smaller trees that might be sub-merchantable, below the size that we can sell, and we might kind of pile those in the stand and burn them, but there's often going to be less of a focus on these smaller removal of these smaller age trees in the kind of single tree selection, because there's not a really good system for dealing with those small trees in this single tree selection silvicultural system. So in this case, this is a photo that's looking up from the ground where a tree has been removed. And so you can see that the removal of this overstory tree has left a little bit more canopy space. So a little bit more light penetration is going to come in, but it's still going to be a fairly closed canopy. So as we said before, this is usually going to support the regeneration of more tolerant trees in the understory. And then here's another view of what this might look like. We have some smaller trees growing up in the understory, but still a pretty significant forest canopy. So one of the problems with single tree selection, at least historically, is that it has often led to a process that's called high grading. So high grading is sometimes referred to as the take the best and leave the rest method, where you come in and you take the trees that you want to send to the mill, that you think that are going to make money, that you think are valuable, and then you kind of leave scraggly trees left behind. And when we talked about even age silvicultural systems, we said if you're leaving certain trees behind after you have a fairly significant removal of trees, you want to remember that those trees are going to be the parents of the next generation of your forest. And so you actually want to leave behind the very best trees. Not all the trees, there's a lot of trees that you can take out, and many of those may hold economic value, but you really want to think about what you're leaving behind, because it's those trees that are going to seed in the next generation of your forest. And so the idea with high grading is that by taking the best and leaving the rest, you're degrading the genetic stock of the trees on your stand, you're diminishing the future diversity and economic return that may be possible on your stand. And this was, at least historically, a very common practice, although there has been significant effort to train foresters so that when they're practicing single tree selection, they're not just always going through and taking the biggest and best trees, but they're being more thoughtful about not only what they're taking, but also what they're leaving behind, as we said. And so single tree selection does not necessitate high grading, but sometimes these processes can go hand in hand. And so you really do want to be careful when you are doing single tree selection to make sure that you're not high grading. And then just as an anecdote, I'll say that a lot of the forest area that is owned by Sierra Pacific Industries, or SPI, which is a really big lumber company or timber company in our area in Northern California, was previously owned by many, many different kinds of landowners, different kind of railroad landowners, etc. And SPI is actually a fairly new company that has amassed a lot of this forest land over the last 60, 70 years. And a lot of the land that they purchased is land that was pretty significantly high graded. And so one of the reasons, certainly not the only reason, but one of the reasons that they have decided to go with an even age, clear-cut silvicultural method is, one, they can grow more wood products faster. It's a little bit more straightforward to manage the forest in that type of way. But one of the arguments that they've made to support their decision is they've said the stands were so high graded that we really wanted to remove the overstory trees, the trees that were left behind, and start fresh. So not everybody would agree that their method is the best method, but that's one of the reasons that they have decided to go with that approach. Okay, so here's another system that is also considered an uneven age system, and that's called group selection. And some people see group selection and think that it looks more like an even-aged type of silvicultural system to them, but because the groups that are cut are fairly small and do not represent the whole stand, this is considered an uneven age silvicultural system. So in group selections, trees are removed and a new age class is established. And this happens in small groups. And usually the objective is to have the groups be about 2 times the height of the mature trees on either side, so that the shade of the trees on both sides, at least during parts of the day, is going to kind of be leaning into about half of the patch, the group, And then also so that there's definitely good access in all parts of the patch that is created, or the what we could call the group, for seeds from the surrounding trees to kind of blow in. And so this allows for much more exposed microclimate compared to when we're just seeing single tree selection that might support the regeneration of trees like ponderosa pine or like sugar pine much more than in a single tree selection system, but it's not creating as big of these exposed microclimate patches as in a clear-cut system. So it's kind of a compromise, and we think it's a compromise that probably mimics pretty closely the kind of patches that would have been created through small scale fire, insect outbreak, root disease patches, etc., in a natural forest stand. And so that's one advantage of a group selection cut. So for scale, this is showing kind of what clear cutting might look like as opposed to group selection. So kind of how big and how open and how even the patches are going to be. So we have a little group that's cut out here, and then you can see that the trees that are growing in are usually going to be tallest right in the center where they're getting the most exposure of sun, a little smaller where they're a little bit more shaded and competing for resources with nearby trees a little bit more aggressively. And you can see that it leads to a more varied structure left behind, whereas in a clear cut, we might have a bigger opening that's going to be leading to the formation of a more even age stand in the future. So this leads to a little bit more structural diversity as opposed to clear cutting. Okay, and then in terms of scale, like I said, a lot of times people might see a group selection and say like, oh, this is a clear cut, and in some ways it is, but it's usually quite a bit smaller, like about 1/10 the size of what a clear cut might be in California, or even smaller. And then again, clear cuts in California are quite a bit smaller than clear cuts in other parts of the world. So even a 20-acre patch removal might be a little bit more similar to the kinds of patchy removals that we had from smaller scale fire insects outbreaks in the past, compared to much like larger water, shed scale removal that might take place in other parts of the world. Okay, another thing I want to mention in the topic of harvesting is something that's called salvage harvesting. So salvage cutting is the removal of dead trees or damaged trees that are dying because of injurious agents, other than just the competition for other resources. And the purpose of removing these trees is to recover the economic value that would otherwise be lost. So usually this happens after a fire, but can also happen after some sort of insect outbreak. And you can come in and cut these trees and send them to the mill. And if you do that fairly quickly, usually there hasn't been a lot of breakdown of the wood by different fungal agents or insect agents. And so if you can get in and do this kind of cutting fairly quickly, you can usually recoup pretty similar economic value than you would be able to get if you were cutting live trees. And there are a lot of kind of exceptions, or you might call them loopholes, or streamlining capabilities that allow people to cut trees through salvage, trees that have already died or are dying, without the same kind of lengthy environmental review process that's involved in other kinds of harvesting in California on federal land and in other places in the US as well. And so that facilitates the kind of quick removal of these trees before they start to break down. Sanitation cutting is kind of within the umbrella of salvage cutting, and that's the removal of trees to improve the stand. And so certain kinds of forest products company like Collins Pine Company, that's based out of Chester in northern part of Plymouth County. They practice mostly single tree selection on their land, although they do have group selections as well as a small handful of clear cuts. And so they do a certain amount of sanitation cutting where they go through their property and they evaluate certain trees that are dying because of insects or other things like that. And so part of their rotation of cutting trees is just taking out these kind of diseased agents, taking out the trees that are dying because one, they're not growing anymore, they're not capturing carbon anymore, and then they don't want those kinds of diseases to spread to other nearby trees. So that would be considered sanitation cutting, and there are kind of loopholes or streamlined ways that you can go and do sanitation cutting on your property without the same kind of environmental and legal review that's required for other cutting, again, on federal property or California property or other public lands. So especially in the age of mega fires, we've seen a lot more salvage harvesting take place on property around us, and I'm sure we'll see a lot more in the years to come. Okay, we'll stop there.